Hi, welcome to the Divine Insight Show. Thank you so much for joining us wherever and whenever you're doing so. I'm thrilled to be here with you today and very excited to introduce you to a wonderful guest that I have here with me here, Darren Gold, to share his work and talk about his most recent book, Master Your Code, The Art, Wisdom, and Science of Leading an Extraordinary Life. I'm thrilled to have him with me today. He's a renowned advisor and a best-selling author, managing partner of the Trium Group, where he advises and coaches CEOs and leadership teams at many of the world's most innovative companies like Roche, Dropbox, Lululemon, Sephora, Cisco, eBay, and many others. Darren, welcome to the show.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me, Travis.
Yeah, you bet. So let's just dive right in. In your work, what have you found that's keeping people from leading the life that they want?
Well, let me start by saying I'm sure many of your listeners are leading wonderful lives, so I don't want to presume anything. And I know it to be a truth that we all have lives, and we all, through the course of our lives, construct our own realities. We form beliefs, values, and rules, what I refer to in the book as our program. I use that metaphor. And that program is a set of beliefs, values, and rules that are subconsciously constructed, designed to keep us safe, but not necessarily designed for us to thrive. And I draw the distinction between a program and a code, which is a set of intentional, consciously constructed beliefs, values, and rules that are really designed for us to thrive and lead an extraordinary life. And so the basic premise of my work and of the book is that we act out of or behave out of a subconscious program that in many cases kept us safe, but doesn't necessarily allow us to lead the sort of lives that we really want to lead. And the book is, in its own humble way, an attempt to offer a bit of a guidebook for how do you go from being run by a program to authoring your own code. And it's in that distinction that I think lies the possibility of really, truly leading an extraordinary life.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. So when you talk about these codes and these programs, and you talk about it being sort of driven by a subconscious program of our own making, one that's a result of our environment, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? I mean, where do these programs come from?
They start very early, very early in childhood, and maybe even earlier than childhood in the womb. But let me offer a personal example, maybe to bring it to life, so we move from the abstract to the real. I was 8 years old when I moved from London, England to the San Fernando Valley, which is a part of Southern California. And I can tell you, while it's cool to have an English accent when you're 18, it's not cool to have it when you're 8 years old. And I was teased mercilessly. Until much later in life, I sort of blocked that out. I didn't remember it as being a particularly painful period, but it certainly was. And what we all do in those sorts of situations in response to any kind of trauma, minor trauma, severe trauma, is we adapt and we create what I call survival strategies. It's sort of the basic code that we write, right? The basic parts of our program. We do whatever it takes to feel safe, to feel included, to be loved, to feel worthy. And my program line of code that I subconsciously constructed in that moment when I was 8 years old was, I need to do everything I can to be likable. And I got really good at it. I got so good at it that it really served me well throughout the early parts of my career. I was the person that would be given to a really difficult client because they knew that I had this sort of likability superpower. And yet it massively limited my effectiveness. I tended to have a real difficulty having mature, open, and direct conversations with people. People that worked for me, I deprived them of essential and valuable feedback. And ironically, I was so good at being likable and so likable that people had a hard time giving me feedback. So I robbed myself of learning and growth and development. And so this is the sort of example. We construct all these rules and beliefs about how we are and how we relate to others and how the world works that reach the limits of their effectiveness. And this is about sort of, for the first time perhaps, really understanding what those are, really examining them for the first time, and then expanding them to include a whole different range of actions. The work I've done on that particular part of my program has contributed, massively to me as a leader, as a coach to leaders, And so that would be an example of what it's like to construct a subconscious program.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think one of the things that you hallmark as sort of a hallmark part of your discussion is about that awareness,
Yeah.
how important it is to be aware of these programs that exist within us. And can you talk a little bit about how folks can identify these beliefs and rules, as you call them, that serve them well and those that might not serve them so well?
Yeah. So my first chapter is on awareness, and it's the foundational capacity to begin to really shift your life, in my view. I say in the book somewhere, it's the domain of what I don't know, I don't know.
Right.
And getting into that domain can be a real breakthrough for people. And so the way we get into that domain of what I don't know is through distinctions. And so I just gave one, which is these survival strategies, right? So before knowing that, I had no idea that I had this rule that I needed to be liked. It was so fused with who I was and my identity, I didn't see it as separate. With the distinction, wait a second, there are some primary survival strategies that we put in place. The need to be included, the need to be right, the need to be smart. I got all of those, by the way. The need to be in control, the need to win, right? All of these things that are designed to protect the ego. With that distinction, I could start to say, wait a second, and this is, me in my kind of late 30s, early 40s, I'm being run by a whole set of rules that I didn't even know existed. Awareness, right? So what I offer in the book is a series of distinctions that begin to give the reader some insight into that domain of I didn't know, and I didn't know I didn't know, which is where the real breakthroughs occur.
Yeah, I think that's so great. And, since we're all sort of, I think about it from sort of a level of our collective consciousness.
Yeah.
And how oftentimes we can kind of relate to someone else's experience and say, ooh, that actually is true for me as well. And so maybe the healing and the work that you've all done with your own personal journey can really resonate with listeners and viewers and readers of the book as well. And what I really liked, what was really kind of cool about, one, the way that you identified what you call those 10 beliefs and rules that really matter most. And you've, of course, organized the book in such a beautiful way of putting a chapter for each one. Would you be able to share one or two, or perhaps one that may have surprised you the most in your own journey, or that you found most useful in your own awareness and growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Where to start? I might say chapter 7, which is I own my identity. And what I really discovered that's been incredibly powerful in my own growth and development and evolution, and in the work that I do primarily with business leaders, senior business leaders, is this notion that we all have an identity. It's an aggregation of beliefs about ourselves, our own capabilities that we build over time. The math teacher that says you weren't a very good math student, out of that experience, I have a belief that I'm not a good math student. And you can imagine a scaffolding of these beliefs that aggregate into something called an identity that most of us don't know exists. Because I ask that question often. I say, okay, what's your identity? And people look at me like I have two heads, right? What do you mean, what's my identity? And so the assertion is we all have an identity. It's subconsciously constructed. And then in the book, I say that one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior is the desire to be consistent with one's identity. So that every action and behavior you take almost has to be consistent with the identity that you hold. And if you begin to sort of see that, and you're like, oh my gosh, of course, right? If I have a self-image or self-concept or an identity that I'm not an author, which is what I share in the book, which I held for quite some time, then I'll talk a lot about writing a book, but I'll never actually write it. And I say, okay, so if that's true, and if something was constructed can be reconstructed, well, I can reconstruct my identity. What if I powerfully and consciously chose a set of beliefs about myself? My actions would then naturally shift. And so I share the experience of, wait a second, I've been holding this subconscious identity that I'm not an author, and all the attendant beliefs. I don't know enough. Nothing I'm going to write is going to be original. No one will be interested in what I have to say. I need more time, right? I'm not an author. What if I declared a new identity that says I'm an author? And within that, I believe strongly that what I have to offer to the world has massive value, is important to be written, is vital to be written. All of a sudden, the actions I took shifted. I was a writer now. That was my identity. And the book that, we're talking about today is a result of that shift in identity. So that's one part of the program that then can become part of your code, which is I don't just live out of an unknown identity. I constructively and consciously author an identity.
That's really fascinating. I appreciate your way of talking about it and developing it. It's very similar to this idea. Most people don't know. I don't talk a lot about it on the show, but I also worked in HR for a number of years for the city of Seattle, and doing HR training, particularly around cultural competency and the way in which we operate with an identity of our group identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we associate with that identity, we have all the schemas, the psychologists would tell us all of those associated beliefs around what it is to be that thing, just like you talk about. So I think it is such an important concept for people to truly understand and how that applies in their own life. And another thing that you talk about that resonated really strongly with me that I'd love to hear more about,
Sure.
if you could share a little bit about, is this concept of polarity thinking. Can you explain what that is and why it's super helpful for folks to understand how to apply its principles in their lives?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such an important, again, another distinction, right? And the distinction that I offer, and it's not my work, it's the work of Barry Johnson, who's done incredible work in this area. And he noticed what, we've known for thousands of years, ancient wisdom, the yin and the yang, that most matters of complexity are polarities. And he draws this distinction, which I talk about in the book, between problems to be solved, which has a, right or wrong answer. Do I hire person A or hire person B? Well, I got to choose. I got to employ or deploy either or thinking, right, to that. The problem is when we begin to see everything in the world as either or decisions, as problems to be solved. And the reality is most complex problems are not problems to be solved. They're polarities. They're natural, healthy tensions that actually can be leveraged to great effect if you change the way you think about them. So, I often use the example of parenting. If anybody that's parented and has done somebody with a partner, you may have experienced this where one parent is very permissive and the other parent really believes in strict rules and boundaries, right? And what ends up happening is you have conflict, right? And they're like, well, it's either we're going to be permissive or we're going to be controlling. And the reality is we're not talking about a problem to be solved because there's wisdom in both poles, right? There's wisdom in being controlling and setting appropriate boundaries. And there's wisdom in giving your children enough space to develop their own personalities and to learn and to, and to scrape their knee. What if we could think about that dilemma, that paradox, as something that's beautiful and natural and healthy, and we could integrate it? And the result of that integration now is an incredible conscious and mature parenting of our children, where we get the value of both without the downside of over-focusing on either. Because you over-focusing on being too controlling and you know what's going to happen. You over-focus on being too permissive and we know the results of that. And so this shows up in every part of our lives. In the organizational context, my polarity that I've worked on for a long time is challenging and celebrating. I tend to have a bias for the challenging pole. When I work with people, I want to hold them to high standards and high standards of excellence. If I'm not careful, I neglect the celebrating because I'm worried that if I do too much celebrating, it breeds mediocrity. And it wasn't until I had this distinction, I said, wait a second, I can be challenging and hold people to high standards and I can celebrate. And it sounds so obvious, but when we step back and we look at how we see the world and how we deal with life, we often fall into that trap. And so for me, it's been a game changer, and the work that I do with business leaders in particular has been really extraordinary.
Yeah, thank you. That's part of why I thought it was such an important concept that people truly understand is we just tend to naturally have this sort of binary thinking and either or and learning by contrast. We know what we want because we see what we don't want. So we don't know how to create something new or different. So it's just really, really fascinating for me. Not only that, but as you talk about these concepts, I found your book to be very accessible, which can be a challenge when people get into what I'll describe as sort of this like love and light thinking and sort of impractical discussions, nebulous terminology and things like that. So can you describe a bit about how readers can, quote, master their code, meaning a little bit about the process to rewrite these programs that are otherwise sort of unwittingly living out unconsciously?
Yeah. Well, the shameless plug will be, of course, read the book. And I say that half jokingly, but that was my intention. Was it's such the human beings and the human mind and body, it's just such a complex phenomenon, right? So to try to boil that complexity and be reductive, reduce it to anything, simple to understand and grasp is a real challenge. And I really wanted to avoid the reductive danger.
Right.
And I wanted to make it really accessible, like you've said. So that was my aim. And I do think, with all humility, the book does a nice job of finding that balance. I think the first step is the one we've already talked about, with the realization that, wait a second, I'm being run by something, a set of values and beliefs and rules, a program, right? And that I have choice, right? I often say the human superpower is the ability to choose the meaning that we give to our circumstances. So life shows up as a series of choices about the meaning that we give to everything. And yet we often go through life, I know I did for several decades, totally programmed, convinced I knew how to react and how to respond. And I finally realized, no, I have multiple choices. I've got huge range of freedom to act and behave and to be conscious and intentional. So that's number one. And then what the book offers is a series of critical places where it's important to be choiceful. So I mentioned one about identity, right? That would be one. And I'd say that's, even though that's chapter 7, I wouldn't skip chapters 1 through 6, but it's a great place to start because, we like to start with ourselves oftentimes. And oftentimes we like to start with others, which is another chapter in the book. But it's these, if you can, like everything, this is a path of mastery that never ends. So it's a slow, methodical working through. The other thing I wanted to make sure that I avoided doing, and I think some books try to do, is look, 10 days to a better life, or,
Right.
this is substantive. I've sort of taken the kind of Eastern, martial arts, Aikido master approach to mastery, which is lifelong pursuit, and some real breakthroughs that can happen in the short term. But it's sort of that methodical taking on aspects of your programming that I would recommend.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's really important for people to understand, is that we often strive for perfection and we want to be do things well. And I think one of the things that as you're talking about, you're making me think about is this idea that we're trying to change the world without changing ourselves. And we really only have a sphere of influence in how we can actually effectively change the world. We can vote with our checkbooks, and then we can live our lives, and how we approach how we live our lives is incredibly important. And so it makes me think, well, don't try to change other people's codes, work on your own and focus on what you can do. I think that's really great. So so thank you. I really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about your work or your book that we haven't already talked about?
Well, maybe just to continue what you were just saying, which is this notion of self-mastery. I start the book with the Stoic philosopher Epictetus and a quote he has, which is, no man can be free without being a master of his own mind. And there is this temptation, this seductive temptation to externalize. It's Gandhi's quote, and actually the real quote is different than what I'll paraphrase, because everybody knows this one, which is, be the change that you want to see in the world. And so we have this sort of reflexive desire to fix others and change others. And underneath everything in my book is a strong invitation to go inward and to master your own code. It's master your code, not master others' code, right? So, and out of that, I share like in parenting, my journey as a parent was, if I want my children to be respectful and polite and to have, good character, however you define that, well, then I ought to be respectful, polite, and exhibit the character traits that I'm hoping that they might adopt. And it's only, or if I want to lead an organization and build a culture, I have to be doing that masterfully before I have any hope or any real desire for others to do that. So I just think that's just such an important takeaway from this conversation, and kind of a theme that runs throughout my work and this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly in the workplace, we spend most of our time in that workplace, a lot of our time of the day. And it's sort of this, like, what I think about in the HR realm is, it's this supervisor training 101, which is like, do what I say, not what I do. It's like people lead, you're the role model, so that people are going to act in the way in which you model. And if people see that you are introspective, reflective, responsive, and even if you disagree, obviously you have the power in the room, but to have a concept of, like, this is what I'm doing within myself, and people see that, then they're able to say, oh, there's some permission available, particularly in the workplace, either to be vulnerable, which I feel is kind of one of our most empowering things to do. So
Yeah.
Anyway, I can talk about that on a whole other show, but
Yeah.
I would love to hear how people can reach out to you or get more information about you or your work, and also get the book.
Great. Yeah. So the book is available on Amazon in hardcover and paperback and Kindle version, and the audiobook, which I narrated. So if you like the sound of my voice, that might be a good option. If you don't, maybe you read it or do both. I have an author website, Darren J. Gold, DarrenJGold.com. And I have some resources on there and you can join a mailing list. And then I am the managing partner at the Trium Group, which is an extraordinary organization based here in San Francisco, where I am today. And we work with the CEOs of a lot of different companies. And that website's a really great resource, triumgroup.com, TRIUM group.com.
Awesome. Terrific. Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you sharing this wonderful book that I hope people are able to get and read, Master Your Code. And thanks for joining me today on the show.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a wonderful week. And you've been watching and listening to the Divine Insight Show.